The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Helene Geismar-Katz, and I'm director of the Center for Adult Life and Learning here at the 92nd Street Y. I welcome you all here this evening. I always like to just give you a sense of a few things that are coming up at the Y in case you've missed them, and I do believe that there are things here at the Y that you won't want to miss. So let me tell you just a few things. Coming up on October 31st is the second in this series on education in America. Commissioner Tom Sobel will be here on October 31st to discuss his thoughts of the future of education and some of his plans, at least in New York State. On October 22nd, Letty Cotton Pogrebin will be speaking with Ann Royfee. Their topic is reconciling feminism and Judaism. November 7th, we have Dr. Callahan, Daniel Callahan, from the Hastings Center, speaking on bioethics, how we can begin to catch up in our ethical mores with the tremendous technology, medical technology in particular, that faces us every day. And then also on November 7th, we do have a tendency to use both halls. We have the beginning of an archaeology series. On November 14th, we will be talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We will also have an evening on Beit Shean, and I have to tell you, I can't remember the third evening. But anyway, it is in cooperation with Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and we just finished a series with them on propaganda that was quite remarkable, and I know that the archaeology series will be the same. That's enough. A little bit about this evening. You received, I hope, cards, little white cards. Yes, those are for your questions. A little bit into the speech this evening, the ushers will go up and down the aisle collecting your cards so that our speaker will be able to read the questions after his remarks and answer your questions. After the whole evening is over, we will be selling the books in the next room, and our speaker will, in fact, be signing them. So for those of you who are interested, please remember to go into the next room when we're done. Okay. On to this evening. For the past few months, when I've thought about this season, and I think that we have a very good lecture season at the Y this year, but whenever I've spoken about it, I've said October 16th, that's the important one. And I do believe that. I think that what we are going to hear tonight is probably among the most important words that we will hear from this stage all year. In 1966, Jonathan Kozol was a school teacher in the Boston Public Schools. In 1967, he published a book on what he had seen of the education that his students were receiving. That book was Death at an Early Age. With that and subsequent books, Jonathan Kozol has prodded our consciences and has made us look at things that we would probably rather not have to see. So too with his new book, Savage Inequalities. Publishers Weekly thinks this book is so critical to the nation's future that it broke its 119-year tradition of never endorsing a book on its front cover when it published an open letter to President Bush urging him to read this book. Many people talk and write about our education system. What is it about Jonathan Kozol's writings that makes him so powerful? I think I found the answer, and I think it's right here in this book. And I'm going to quote. I decided early in my journey to attempt to listen very carefully to children, and whenever possible, to let their voices and their judgments and their longings find a place within this book, and maybe too, within the nation's dialogue about their destinies. I hope that in this effort, I have done them justice. It is truly my honor to introduce to you this evening Jonathan Kozol.
Thanks, Lane. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. As Elaine just pointed out, it's about a quarter century now since I started out as a young teacher in the public schools in Boston. 2 years ago, I felt a longing to go back and see if anything had changed. So I set out from my home. I still live near Boston, and I visited in over 30 schools across the country, from East St. Louis and Chicago to several cities in New Jersey, from Cincinnati to New York and Washington and San Antonio. I'd like to tell you that I found dramatic changes from a quarter century ago, but this would simply not be truthful. Public schools in the United States remain still separate, still unequal, and more separate and less equal than they were when I began. In school after school that I visited, 95 to 99% of the children were non-white. In no school that I saw anywhere in the United States were white and non-white children in large numbers truly intermingled. The statistics for school funding differentials were worse than anything that I recalled from my first year of teaching. Wealthy New Trier High School, for example, that's in the town of Willamette, Illinois, spends half again as much on every child as the schools of Chicago do. Princeton spends twice what all Black and Hispanic Camden can afford to spend. Great Neck spends more than twice what New York City spends. What seems self-evident, but oddly enough is never stated bluntly in the press, is that the Brown decision is now dead as far as social policy is concerned in public education. As a principal in one urban district said to me, we are still fighting to achieve the promise made 100 years ago in Plessy versus Ferguson. Our schools are separate, and they're still not equal. It's often noted that social policy in the United States, to the extent that it concerns Black children and poor children, has been turned back several decades during the Bush and Reagan years. But this, in some respects, may be an understatement. In public schooling, social policy has been turned back almost a century. What puzzles me, honestly, is that the press so seldom speaks of that. It's like the great unmentionable. Let me take you with me on a journey. In a South Bronx neighborhood in which the rate of infant death is higher than in Bangladesh, the rain poured in through the roof of Morris High on rainy days, filling a rain barrel in the 9th grade counseling office and making a waterfall in the main stairway. I asked a counselor how the children felt about it. I was looking for a complicated answer. I said something like, how do they relate to the rain? Like a sociologist's question. And she said they'd just like to see the rain stop in their school. I visited a grade school in the Bronx where 1,330 non-white children, I hate to use that word non-white. It sounds as though blacks are defined only as a negative, but I'm referring, when I say that, to Black, Hispanic, Dominican, other kids. 1,330 children filled a building meant to hold about 800. It wasn't a school building, it was a skating rink. School system, New York City, just couldn't afford to give these kids a school. They're in a skating rink. No windows. Children were stifled by lack of air. There was no place to play inside or outside. Kids had to eat their lunch in 10 or 12 minutes because they had to eat in so many shifts. Class size soared from 32 to 37, 38 children. 5 classes took place in one huge undivided room. A library, an airless cubicle, held 700 books. I actually stopped and counted them. 700 books. No encyclopedias. I asked a teacher, where are the encyclopedias? Do they keep them in the classrooms? I thought, maybe this was something innovative and they have the encyclopedias, the reference books in the classrooms to do research. She just shrugged and said, we have no encyclopedias, that's for the suburbs. A high school student in the Bronx, young man I first met when he was homeless in the Martinique Hotel, he's now about 17, 18, told me last September, that there were 50 children in his homeroom, but only 40 desks. When everyone shows up, he said, 10 of us have to stand along the wall. First-year English teacher at another high school in the Bronx. This is a wonderful young woman that I'd met 2 years ago when she was a senior at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She'd been planning to go and teach in a rich suburb like the one she grew up in, maybe a place like Bloomfield Hills or Grosse Pointe, which are wealthy suburbs of Detroit, similar to Great Neck or Manhasset. And she was a really terrific young person. She'd majored in English and had done honors work in English, but she was also certified as a teacher. And after she heard me talk out there, she asked me whether I had any suggestions, and I said, yeah, come to New York. Take a job in a place where you're needed, where people like you are needed. So she came here, and she got assigned to a high school in the Bronx. A little tiny person. She's barely 5 feet tall, maybe less than 5 feet. She became a 9th grade English teacher. She called me a week after school started. She said, I have 5 classes, 44 children in each class. And she said they're also using a jackhammer outside my classroom all week. The whole year, she reported they were out there reconstructing something, which was never finished. And I remember that, that first call, she said, I don't know what to do with 44 children. I had 18 in my senior class when I was in high school. She said she couldn't even remember all their names. She couldn't recognize them all. A girl came in today, she said this to me on the phone, a girl I'd never seen. I told her we didn't have a desk for her. I said she'd have to wait and see if someone didn't come so she could have a place to sit. She looked at me and shrugged and said, don't bother then, I'm leaving. Principal told her not to worry. Half the students would be gone by Christmas. It's awful, she said, to realize that the New York City schools are budgeted on the assumption that we can induce 1/2 of all these kids to fail and quit. And then she said something that any teacher, of course, understands. She said, if I had 20 students in each class, half of those kids would not quit because I'd have twice as much time for every one of them, and I'd go to their homes, and I'd meet their parents, and I'd talk to them, and I'd see them on weekends. But I can't do that, she said, with 220 children. I get so angry when these vicious folks in Washington these days, William Bennett and his young disciples, these sort of mean-spirited young people, I don't know where they come from, but there's a whole generation of these sort of tough young right-wing ideologues. They're groomed at the Dartmouth Review and then shipped to the Heritage Foundation and then to the White House. And, you know, and they talk about holding teachers accountable, getting tough with teachers, give those New York City teachers competency tests. I don't know why they always add that extra syllable. When I grew up, the word was competence, but I guess they think it sounds more imposing. They say competency. You know, they're always talking about punishing the kids and punishing the teachers. I say, you know, first give that good young teacher 20 children in her class like they have in Great Neck. Give her a decent salary, give her a clean building, give her enough textbooks, a real school library, computers, then hold her accountable. Principals in Chicago spoke of days when substitute teachers are so scarce that 20,000 children in the city come to class and find no teacher. Not even a sub. City can't afford them. Even on ordinary days, I learned, substitutes make up 1/4 of all the teachers in Chicago. At DuSable High School in the Robert Taylor Homes, the second poorest congressional district in the nation, that neighborhood, second only to the South Bronx. Teachers and students in science lab were cutting down plastic soda bottles to make lab equipment because the school couldn't afford to buy lab dishes. The school, which is 100% black, has a graduation rate of 25%. Then there was the grade school in Chicago where a third grade teacher tried to do a dictionary lesson. You know how that works. The teacher reads a word and the children flip through their dictionaries and try to see who can find it first and read the definition. And the school so poor they had to have 3 kids share every dictionary. Little boy would look for the word when she read it. And when he found the word, he ripped the page out of the dictionary and folded it and put it in his pocket. Teacher said, leave the pages in the dictionary. Somebody else is going to want to use that book. That's their problem, said the child. This is my word. Later, a principal in Chicago said how sad that is. Children in affluent suburbs do not need to steal words from a dictionary. Whoever thought, the principal said this, whoever thought the ownership of words would come to be a scarce commodity in our society? Then there was the school in New Jersey in which the children in word processing had to work without word processors. They used old Olympia typewriters, old manual typewriters, the kind I threw away around 1955. I asked the teacher, are there any offices in New Jersey where they still use typewriters, manual typewriters? She said, no, they use computers, but we can't afford them. I tell the kids the keyboard's virtually the same. In East St. Louis, an all-black city buried in the toxic smoke of waste incinerators and 2 chemical plants, a city the local press refers to as America's Soweto, I walked into decrepit bathrooms that had neither soap nor water, sinks nor toilet seats nor even toilet paper. It was like a scene out of the Old South in the 1940s. The city's so poor there's been no garbage collection for 4 years. Heaps of garbage have been piled in the backyards of the children's homes. Shortly before I visited, the sewer mains exploded in the city. Some of the schools filled up with sewage to their second floors. There's a school in East St. Louis named for Martin Luther King. A child who went there told me this. The school is full of sewer water, and the doors are locked with chains. Every child in that school is black. Why, she asked me, is it named for Dr. King? It's like a terrible joke on history. I was an 8th grader. A child at a school in New York City wrote this 2-line poem, America the Beautiful, who are you beautiful for? But if you want to drink of sorrow deeply, you have to visit in a kindergarten in one of these inner city schools. I like to visit at 11 in the morning when the children have their naps, when they're lying on those little mats on the floor, breathing deeply. There's always one who's squirming around, but you know, they're supposed to be sleeping. You look at these kids and you think how absolutely vulnerable they are, how much their destinies depend on us. At the Mary McLeod Bethune School in Chicago, in North Lawndale in Chicago, I stand and watch the kindergarten children in their sleep. Nearly 1,000 infants die within these poor Chicago neighborhoods each year because of their mother's inability to get prenatal care. Another 3,000 are delivered with brain damage. But in this kindergarten on a clear October day, you'd have no sense that anything was wrong. Kindergarten classes almost anywhere are cheerful places. Whatever damage has been done to children isn't obvious. 9 years from now, I'm told, most of these kids will go on to an ugly high school just a block away that has a graduation rate of 32%. 12 years from now, 2/3 of these little boys and girls will have dropped out. 14 years from now, 4 of these kids at most may go to college, but another 4 will have already been in prison. If you stand here and you don't know this, the moment seems almost auspicious. You think to yourself, these are babies. They have the world before them. But if you know the future that awaits them, it's just terrible to see their eyes look up at you with friendliness and trust. To see this and to know the certitude with which that trust will be betrayed. These children are entirely innocent. They have done nothing wrong. They have committed no crime. Their only crime is to be born poor in a rich society. Just terrible to look at kids in a school like that, and especially the squalor of these buildings. Some of these buildings are so ugly. They're so ugly. I think to myself, why would we consent to let these children spend their childhood in squalid, filthy buildings where not one of us would ever dream of working for 1 hour? Does America still love its children? Sometimes I come out of one of these schools and I just feel, I don't even feel like writing. I feel like crying. I feel like a child myself. I think to myself, so many years, so many lives. Could all my work and that of all those teachers and those other people that I've known for 30 years, could all this have come to nothing? I wish I could tell you that New York is the great exception to these injustices, but it is not. The inequalities, the racial segregation are, if anything, more savage here than in any other city in America. Indeed, to be honest with you, the most segregated schools I've seen in the United States are here in New York City. The least segregated are in Mississippi. In this case, in New York, it's not just the gulf that separates the suburbs from the city. It's also the inequities within the city and within its public schools. Let me give you an example. As most of you know, New York City schools are subdivided into 32 school districts. District 10 is a large district. It includes a large part of the Bronx, poorest of Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, but also an almost all-white neighborhood in Riverdale, a wealthy section home to many of this city's most sophisticated families. I know a lot of folks who live there. Public School 24, PS 24 in Riverdale, contrasts dramatically with every other school that I've described to you tonight. Dogwoods and magnolias surround the school on a spring morning. It's really a beautiful school. Playgrounds, playing fields, handsome lawns, well-tended, a park across the street, another one a block or two away. Inside the impeccably maintained building, class size averages maybe 22, 23 children. Computers everywhere. A library holds 8,000 volumes for 800 children. In the school set in the skating rink, by contrast, as I said before, 1,300 children have the use of 700 books. Hate to say that with so much edge. I know it sounds as though I'm angry, but it's hard to speak of it without anger. That's why my book has that tough title, Savage Inequalities. It's not just sad, it's brutal, utterly unjust. PS 24 is a potentially desegregated school. Of a little more than 800 children there are about 125, 135 Black and Hispanic kids. In mainstream classes, however, typical classes, you see virtually no Black or Hispanic children, maybe a couple in each class. In the gifted classes, I saw no Black children at all. All the children in gifted were white, or in some cases Asian children. Where are the Black children? I find them when I enter special class. In 12 separate special classes, almost every child that I see is non-white, Black or Hispanic. Who are these kids, I ask? Why are they here? These children, I'm told, are classified. They have these awful labels in New York, as everywhere. They're classified EMR or TMR. Educable, mentally retarded, trainable, mentally retarded. How can this be, I ask? Turns out that in order to demonstrate some effort towards desegregation, the school board has assigned here only non-white children who are thought to be brain damaged or in other ways retarded, so that the school statistically appears desegregated, but is in fact two separate schools within one building. The lesson for white children in the school, of course, is that Black kids are stupid, because those are the only kids they see. The lesson for Black children is that only whites are gifted. A terrible, terrible lesson to teach children. Just a nightmare. I never thought I'd see that in New York. This is but one of many, many instances of the betrayal of democracy in the New York City public schools. Riverdale, of course, is not a redneck neighborhood. It's not like the rough neighborhoods of South Boston or the remembered angry neighborhoods of Mississippi from the 1960s. No, Riverdale's been home for many years to some of the most progressive people in the nation. Dozens of college students from that neighborhood went south during the civil rights campaigns, risked their lives for the desegregation of the schools and restaurants and stores in Mississippi. Parents of these students often made large contributions to support the work of SNCC and CORE. One generation passes, and the cruelties they fought in Mississippi have come north to New York City. Suddenly, no doubt unwittingly, they find themselves opposed to simple things they would have died for 20 years ago. Perhaps it isn't fair to say that they're opposed. A better word, more accurate, would be oblivious. They do not want poor children to be harmed. They simply want the best for their own children. To the children in the South Bronx, it is all the same. It feels so sad to see that. You know, I go up to places like Riverdale and out to Great Neck, and I visit old friends, and they get out their old scratchy Pete Seeger records in my honor. And we hear those wonderful old songs, "Wasn't That a Time?" But it doesn't seem to shape the way they deal with life today. I just can't tell you the sense of darkness, even hopelessness I feel. I am afraid that we are moving in an irreversible direction. Two nations, two cities right here in New York, two absolutely separate and divided worlds, millions of children written off entirely, a social Darwinist milieu in which we seem to have decided that our poorest children are, in fact, expendable. The president says that money is not the issue. Dollars don't buy education, he said last spring. He even went to New Jersey and lectured the parents of poor children who were struggling to get more money into their schools. Camden, as you know, is an all-black Hispanic city. Camden spends only $4,000 per year per pupil, even though it has one of the highest property tax rates in the state of New Jersey. But its property isn't worth anything. Princeton pays a lower tax rate but spends $8,000 on each child. A lot of $500,000 homes in Princeton. The parents of the poor children were lobbying and suing in the courts, begging for more funding for their children's schools in Camden and Patterson, Newark, Jersey City. The president came to New Jersey and he lectured parents of poor children on the foolishness of overestimating the significance of money. A society, said the president, a society that worships money is a society in peril. I thought that was an astonishing statement, an extraordinary statement from a man whose parents bought him the most expensive education money can buy. Andover costs about $20,000 per pupil now. What an extraordinary thing to tell poor people. A society that worships money is a society in peril. Why didn't he tell that to his oil friends in Houston? Why didn't he tell it to the folks in Princeton? If money is good for the education of George Bush at Andover, it's good for the child of the poorest poor black woman in the South Bronx or Camden or Chicago. It's a real triumph of right-wing ideology that they've been able to persuade us even to waste time in discussion of such questions. The wonderful principal of Camden High told me of going out to speak in Princeton. I tell them, she said, if you don't believe that money makes a difference, send your kids to school in Camden. Trade with our children. Start in second grade. When I say this, she told me, people will not meet my eyes. They look down at the floor. They feel ashamed. Instead of speaking of money, The White House talks about restructuring. Restructuring is the buzzword of the decade, a cost-free innovation. But restructured destitution is still destitution. The president now is calling for a national exam, a naive and gratuitous idea. American children already take 200 million tests a year. When will the president understand that tests do not teach reading? Only well-paid teachers do. Any old farmer in Vermont can tell the president, you don't fatten your lambs by weighing them. But we're spending a lot of time weighing our lambs these days, and if the president has his way, a lot of those lambs are going to get thinner. What should we do? If we really hope to turn our rhetoric to action, we should do at least 6 things. Number 1, there ought to be immediate full funding to provide Head Start to every eligible 3- and 4-year-old within this country, with an additional component to give literacy education to their parents when they need it. Head Start, as most of you know, is now denied to 3/4 of the eligible children in this country. It would cost a mere $5 billion to give Head Start to every kid who needs it. The president says that he agrees that Head Start is a good thing, but he says we just don't have the money. There's no money, he says, for Head Start. We just can't give it to every child. In that curious New England style of his, he says, we have more will than wallet. You know, I go up to Washington every couple of years and I beg for money for things like Head Start. A mere $5 billion every time they tell me there's just no money, no money. Then I open the paper one day and suddenly a war breaks out in the Persian Gulf over a country that I'd never heard of, and we spend $50 billion of our own or our allies' money. Where did that money come from? Second, we should reduce the class size to 20 children in every inner city and low-income rural school. That's typical class size in the suburbs. Third, we should assign the highest salaries to win and keep the finest teachers in the schools that serve the poorest children. Must be some teachers there. But I absolutely agree with them. I mean, you know, there's been a huge amount of rhetoric, again, misguided rhetoric from Washington. We're spending so much money on our schools and it doesn't pay off, but they never ask where we're spending it. I know a teacher who's worked, a well-educated guy who went to Brandeis University and could have done anything he wanted in life, who, what happened? What'd you say? Oh, I can't smell it up here.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yeah.
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 You're right.
What is it?
There is a fire alarm bell. It's not serious, but we have been asked by the crew to please evacuate the auditorium. We're terribly sorry for this, but it's one of those things. And the audience, which did notice it, was 100% correct.
Oh, is that why they got up?
Yes,
I was making them angry.
no. And I saw them all leaving, so I came up to find out what it was all
Isn't
about.
that interesting? Wow. Should we go out also? Yeah.
So
Isn't it?
quite smoky.
so slow.
That's all right. Anything can happen.
This is one of those never a dull moment situations.
Just pick up? I can do it spontaneously.
I just want to tell them what it was, so they're not too nervous.
I'm going to speak.
And then that's it.
I'm going to speak. I'll wind up, and I was within 5 minutes of my ending, and then I'm going to take questions.
Do you have enough
for 20
questions?
minutes.
Do you have enough questions there?
Yeah.
I have more,
No,
but
I have
I
them
thought
all
those were much more interesting than these.
Is
You're right, you can't smell it from up here.
there something that I'm supposed to do after this is over?
Yes, you're supposed to go in the next room and sign books.
And that will take, what do you think, maybe 15, 20 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I better hurry. I better get to the question soon then.
Okay. Are we in? Okay. This is a never a dull moment department. I'm sorry. What it was, just so that you know, it was an oil burner overheating. Not toxic, nothing to worry about, just obviously very annoying. But anyway, we're going to start exactly where we left off with Dr. Kozol.
Well, when I started speaking before, I was sort of intimidated because I couldn't see anybody the way the lights are here. I could barely see any faces. So that was quite a change, Now I got to meet about half of you standing on the sidewalk, shivering. And I'm also relieved to know that I hadn't suddenly offended. So I was wondering, I thought, what did I say? I thought I did something awful at that moment. But, I was coming to the real point where I was going to stop and invite your questions, which I now have. The only final points I wanted to make were these. I don't see any way that we're ever going to have genuine equality in schooling in America until we get rid of the property tax as the primary source of school funding in local districts. I mean, it is inherently unjust. It is the purest form of inheritance of wealth. It's it's almost a guarantee of sort of a hereditary meritocracy. And in my mind, if I had all the power in the world, I would try to persuade this nation someday to get rid of the property tax and to finance our schools solely out of a steeply graduated progressive income tax, or if we continue to tax property, at least to have all that money go into a common fund to be distributed equitably to children according to their needs. Now, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to imagine that that will ever happen. And realistically, I don't know if that will ever happen. And that last point is more important to me than the specifics of how we finance our schools. I mean, the real question is, what does America believe about fair play? I mean, do we want to make it a level playing field? It will never be a completely level playing field. We know that because we know all the kids who will, even in the best of circumstances, even with truly equitable schooling, will still bring into school all the damage that's been done to them already by society, by poor health, by rotten housing, by all the nightmarish long hours spent waiting at hospital clinics to get examined in emergencies, all the years and months that poor kids have lived with rotting teeth and untreated abscesses in their gums, all those things that debilitate children. I mean, all those things will still be there. And so it's never going to be a completely level playing field in education, but at least to the degree that the public schools can control for fair play. I mean, do we even want that? Does society even, are we ever likely to see that? And I don't know. You see, back in 1965, when I was first teaching in 64, 65, and published in 67, I mean, I was incredibly naive and innocent, and I really thought that if I wrote, I thought that I had discovered something terrible in really rotten segregated schools. I thought I discovered something rotten that most Americans didn't know about. And then now that I knew it, I would describe it as well as I could, and people would read it and they would say, "Good Lord, that's awful. Let's fix it." You know, so I wrote my book, I published it, this was back there in the 60s. It won quite a bit of praise, to be honest. And, you know, it was, and I won prizes and everything, and I thought, oh, this is great. Now, any day now, all this will change, because now everybody knows. But it didn't happen like that, by no means. And so I'm not naive any longer, and I don't think that this new book, even though it's beginning to receive the same kind of attention that the first book did, and, you know, it will probably survive in the same way as the sequel to that book, I don't know whether knowing is going to change anything for people. I mean, that's the thing that's so hard for me to understand. And I don't have any simple answers to the question. I really don't. But as I look ahead, I feel deeply troubled. I mean, I feel deeply, deeply worried. I believe that we are moving to almost a garrison society in our big cities now, a kind of terrible pedagogic apartheid, which seems almost unbreakable. I met some very nice New York City school kids this afternoon who came up to my hotel room to interview me for a wonderful group called Children's Express. It's like a children's wire service, and they're really bright, nice kids from the New York City schools. And two of them go to Stuyvesant High School. They're white young women. I think they're 10th graders. Extremely nice, smart kids. And they were telling me about the school, which they quite like. It's, as some of you know, that's one of the few really top-rated high schools in New York City. That's one of the two that non-New Yorkers hear about, Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, a couple others maybe. So I asked them at one point, what's the ethnic makeup at that school? And they looked at each other kind of nervously, as though they didn't know whether they wanted to answer me. And I said, go ahead, I'm not going to get angry at you. Just tell me the truth. And they said, well, in our science lab, we have 45 kids. That in itself is amazing. That's a huge class, 45 children. And I said, how many of them are black? And they said, not one. Every child is white. I said, in the whole school, how many black kids are there? They said maybe 2,500 students, 2,500 students at Stuyvesant High. They figured there might be 50 black children. That would be like 2.5%. And I thought, good Lord, how can that be? My knowledge is that certainly more than half the kids in the New York City public schools are not white. Isn't that true? Might be more like 2/3. 80%? I mean, if that's so, how can that be? And I mean, I'm not standing here saying something simplistic. I didn't want to come down to New York today and deliver kind of a little expose of illegal practices in the New York schools. That's not the point of my talk. What I'm saying is that, I'm not saying that there was racist selection at the school or anything like that, because I don't know enough to make such statements. And besides, I've seen the same thing everywhere else in America. So it's nothing special about New York. What I am saying is that either the admissions process to these selective high schools is profoundly racist, or else, even worse, we have truly created, through prior demolition of our children, of the poorest children and the black children especially, we have created two entirely separate categories of human beings. I mean, that's the nightmarish. And when I was standing there at PS 24, I thought what I hope is true is that the tests are racist, and that's why all these black kids are in special class. I was hoping that was true. I thought that would be the best explanation. The worst explanation was that those kids really were brain damaged, that they had been ruined already. But whichever the explanation, it's a nightmare to see things like that. So I'm obviously, I can't end this on an upbeat note. I'd like to say to you, despite all these things I've said tonight, there is this one terrific school I know about in East Harlem, or the North Bronx, or Brooklyn, or Chicago, or somewhere. And that school has this terrific principal, and she's developed this new reading system, and they have figured out what really works, and they've solved the problem, and she's turning it all around. That's the requisite phrase, you know. They're turning it all around, and that is so good that we just have to copy what she's doing everywhere else, and we'll solve the problem cost-free. But I wouldn't fool you with an upbeat ending like that, because we've all seen hundreds of models like that for 2 or 3 decades now. Those models come, and they're usually good and exceptional and non-replicable, and they go. The press builds them up 1 year. They get a good story in the Chicago Trib or the New York Times, revolution in East Harlem or somewhere else. And a few years later, 5 years later, we say, whatever happened to that program? Oh, it's gone. They couldn't maintain the funding. It's wonderful to light candles in the darkness, but the house of poverty isn't going to be illuminated with more candles. We've got to be speaking about the fuse box. And the fuse box of this issue is the unjust, unfair, unequal way we finance education, and beyond that, the ultimate profound moral dilemma of whether we really, really believe in an honest competition, whether we really believe in that. It often occurs to me that the wealthy people I know out in Great Neck wouldn't dream of playing Little League the way they play the game of education. They would never send their kids out on the ball field with baseball mitts and say, this other team you're going to play from the Bronx is going to play with bare hands. They'd be ashamed to do that. Why then do we rig the education game the way we do? I don't know the answer. Let's do some questions, because there's not too much time, okay? Yes. I know, because of the fire, I forgot one of them. Here we go. I realize there are a few students here who have to take notes, and their teacher tomorrow isn't going to care at all about what I said. Just want to make sure you have all 6 points down. The first one was full funding of Head Start. The second one was cut class size in the inner city schools to 20 children maximum. The third was to pay the highest salaries to the teachers who have to teach in the inner city schools so we can keep good teachers here. The fourth thing was that we ought to have a federal school construction act, legislation to provide a one-time grant of about $50 billion, roughly what we spent in Desert Storm, to rebuild all these collapsing inner city schools like Morris High School and turn them into the beautiful schools they should be. If we did that, maybe a lot more white people would be willing to send their kids into these schools. The fifth point was that we should stop pretending that charity, those famous 1,000 points of light, are any substitute for government-guaranteed justice, because we know that just never works. It's nice to have people give charity, but that's no substitute for justice. And the sixth point was that we ought to get rid of the property tax completely and replace it by a steeply graduated progressive state income taxes and a more steeply graduated federal income tax, all of which would go into a common pool of money and then be assigned equitably to children according to their real needs. And I guess after I said all that, I stopped and thought to myself, but none of this is going to happen. So that's why I continued in that more somber mood. So these are some of the questions I got. Can you comment on President Bush as the education president? What? I guess I don't need to answer that now, do I? I think I kind of answered that already. Why do you think there is no mass protest? This is a good question. Why do you think there is no mass protest, no marches on Washington? How can we do something to change our government's disrespect of children and abuse of children? Well, that's the kind of question I've been asking lately all the time. I mean, maybe sometimes when I'm at these government-type meetings, Washington dinners and things, where I really try to reason, and I win some people over, but when it's done, nothing's really changed. I begin to think, maybe this government will only act on this if they're scared. I mean, if they're scared of the wrath, the just indignation of all these children. I don't mean scared physically. I'm not proposing, to incite people to riot. I'm just saying scared, terrified, in the same way that the Senate was briefly, all too briefly, terrified of the wrath of women last week. It didn't last long enough, but it worked for a few days. And I must say, up until those hearings this weekend, I had been a great admirer of and a friend of Senator Biden, but I just felt heartsick at the way they just caved in. As Democrats didn't even give it a fight. Watching that and seeing the intense oratorical frenzy of people like Senator Simpson, is that his name? Yeah. Senator Simpson, Hatch, and the guy from Pennsylvania, or Arlen Specter. I mean, they were smart and tough and mean and loud and effective, unfortunately. And the Democrats just caved in completely. They were so meek and intimidated. I like Senator Simon enormously. I think he's one of the best people we have in American politics, but utterly unable to fight back. I kept thinking of that line from Yeats. Remember that line? The best lack all conviction, but the worst are full of passionate intensity. I thought of that again and again last weekend. I'd like to see a massive march, protest. I'd like to see the day when these poor kids, not just the poor black kids, but the poor white kids who are getting decimated in a almost closely comparable way in these poor rural districts around the country. There are some really bleak, poor rural white neighborhoods around this country, up in Maine and Arkansas, and western Massachusetts. Good Lord, out in western Massachusetts, one school district is going to move to a 4-day school week because they can't afford to keep school open 5 days a week. And our Republican governor of Massachusetts, who sends his daughter to Shady Hill, the nicest and most expensive prep school in Cambridge, has approved the idea of a 4-day week for poor children. I'd like to long for the day when all these kids and their parents and their teachers, instead of getting angry at the poor, God-forsaken principal or their superintendent, superintendents always take the brunt of everybody's rage because he or she is the most visible target. The time they'll get really angry at the people who have real power. And that doesn't mean getting mad at Joe Fernandez, who seems like a pretty decent guy, or a local superintendent in New York City, or least of all, Mayor Dinkins. It means getting angry at people who have real power, financial power over the destinies of our children. That means the legislature up in Albany, the governor, and most of all, the people in the White House. I mean, I'd like to see the day when we could get 500,000 people in Washington, not to protest about a war in Chile or something, or in some other country, a third world nation, but about the third world right here in America. And I'd like to see that happen. There's been some talk of a mass march on Washington next spring, children's advocates and children from all over the country. They haven't spoken about building it around the schools. They've been talking more about nutrition and hunger. but I'd like to see that build into a colossal march. I'd like to see the sight of 500,000 children standing in the mall in Washington. Of course, you know, if we do that, what they'll say, oh, there they are manipulating children to tug at our heartstrings. But I don't know. I think we've got to get much tougher and more aggressive, and maybe that's the way to do it. There's a question here. It says, I hear people say our elementary schools are basically okay, just that our high schools and junior highs are weak. Do you agree? Absolutely not. I think that most kids drop out psychologically by 3rd or 4th grade, 5th grade maybe, and you just don't see it until junior high and high school. I think that if I had all the power in the world, if I were Education Secretary of this country, I would put all our priorities to start with on Head Start, pre-K, kindergarten, and even just the first 5 years of school, those first 4 or 5 years. I mean, I often think the battle is won or lost during those years. And that's where I would start, at least. If New York City had the same per pupil spending as Great Neck, would they be as good? Well, that's a very good question. Probably not at first, for a lot of reasons. For one reason, Great Neck would still have an awful lot of non-school support, obviously pouring into that school system. It would have all the resources of an enormously educated, sophisticated parent population, which can do a lot of extra stuff for its kids. Also, of course, Great Neck would have the other advantage of a school plant, which is already in fairly good shape. I haven't been there recently, but if I could give an example of a school system I did see, the Rye Public Schools. I mean, that high school in Rye just looked to me like, that looked like the most beautiful prep school in New England. It's just an incredibly beautiful building in all ways. Something would have to be done to start with. If we were really going to play this game on an even field, there would have to be a one-time investment of a huge amount of money to rebuild the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of the urban schools, so that they would start with buildings that children wouldn't be ashamed to go to every morning. And that would take a lot of money. The ex-principal of Morris High estimated that it would take $50 million to make that building suitable for students. Couple more questions. Why not raise all the schools, R-A-Z-E, raise all the schools, open up more libraries and community centers with all that extra money? School as an institution, compulsory, is the problem. I disagree. To be honest, around 1972, if you'd questioned me then, I might have said something very much like that. That was the year after I met a prophetic Jesuit named Ivan Illich. Any of you remember him? And when I came back from Mexico, from Cuernavaca, where I met him, and Paulo Freire the same weekend, and Paul Goodman, it was quite an intoxicating weekend for me. When I came back, I spent the first few weeks telling all my friends, mostly black parents in Boston, that we should stop talking about schools. And they kept looking at me kind of strange. I kept saying, you know, we have to de-school. That was his verb. We have to de-school society. And they kept saying to me, what did you eat in Cuernavaca? You know, what did you drink there? Well, you know, in the best of all possible worlds, maybe it would be great if we didn't need an institution like, you know, a mandatory attendance at a school, public school. Maybe it would be great someday if we didn't need that. But in this society, I think it would be a tragedy if we turned our back on the familiar institution known as public school. I think that the public school system, particularly now in the United States, has an absolutely precious role. It is almost the only remaining arena of potential democracy. I mean, it is one of the few places where at least sometimes rich and poor and black and white can meet, can share a certain part of their existence can find a common destiny. I mean, we have betrayed that bitterly in the past 20 years, but that has always been the dream in the United States. Even Thomas Jefferson, despite his blindness on the issue of race, which was shared by all his contemporaries, sort of envisioned the kind of all-inclusive egalitarian school system which Horace Mann ultimately concretized. And I may be awfully old-fashioned, but it seems to me the problem is not in the institution and it's not in the dream. It is in the way we have starved the schools that serve our poorest children. It is in the ways that we have misused our schools, and in the big cities, the way that most affluent people have simply deserted them. I mean, a lot of people say to me, is the issue race or is it money? I say that if New York City had the same kind of money that Great Neck has, well, first of all, right off the bat, that would mean that any class of 30 kids in New York City would suddenly have an extra $250,000 to spend on them each year. Isn't that extraordinary? Now, I'd like George Bush to look a principal in the South Bronx in the eyes and tell her that that wouldn't make a difference. You know? I mean, think what you could do with $250,000 extra. And let's assume the worst that conservatives say, that these inner city school systems are poorly administered and they waste a lot of money. Let's assume the worst and assume that they wasted $100,000 out of that $250,000. If even $150,000 got into that classroom, think what you could do. For $150,000, you could split that class of 30 kids into 2 classes of 15 children each. And you could steal 2 of the best teachers from Great Neck at salaries of $50,000 each to come and teach them. And you could use the other $50,000 to buy a whole lot of computers and paint the walls. I mean, I'm a great believer in simple things. When they say to me in Washington, can you really solve these kinds of problems by throwing money at them? You ever heard that question? When they say that to me, I always look them right in the eyes and I say, sure. That's the best way to do it. That's the best way. Throw it, deliver it in an armored car, stuff it in my pockets, and I'll bring it to the Bronx myself. I don't know any better way to repair the roof of Morris High School. And if President Bush knows another way to do it, I wish he'd tell us. I'm getting signals from the back that I ought to sit down because I have to go at 10 o'clock to tape a new program on Channel 13, Charlie Rose's new program. And I can't be late for that, and I wanted to leave a few minutes to sit out in front and chat with a few people who bought my book on the faith that I would sign it. So I'd like to really thank you all for being here tonight. It was kind of a crazy, odd evening, but I enjoyed it anyway. And I would particularly like to thank my wonderful friend. I have a great friend who's here tonight. Actually, there are about 10 good friends, but one of them, the youngest of them, is a very special person in my life. He's a young man whom I met, and I don't think he'll mind me saying this, when he and his mom were homeless in the Martinique Hotel. I met them in 1985, and they were the strongest, most brave, decent people I'd ever met. They survived those years there without ever falling into trouble, crime, or anything else, came out of it clean and wholesome with a lot of troubles and a lot of worries and a lot of medical fears and things to make their life tough, but they never lost their courage. And now he is a student in the New York City public schools and came here tonight by coincidence with a camera crew that was videotaping us. His name is Richard Fields. Richard, will you stand up? You're a wonderful kid.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.